Okay, so you want to own a medieval island. Not a country estate, not a manor with a nice view of the river. An island. A ring of rock and grass with the sea on every side, no neighbor you can ride to for help, and a horizon that decides, on any given morning, whether a single ship reaches you or 20. You picture gulls, cliffs, maybe a little harbor with fishing boats bobbing in it, and yourself standing on a headland like you own the place. Which, in this scenario, you do. Here is the first thing nobody tells you. The sea is not a wall. It is a toll booth. Every ship that needs to round your coast, shelter from a storm in your bay, or stop for water on a long haul between two mainland ports has to reckon with you, whether you built a castle or just own the rock they are trying not to wreck on. An island lord's entire economic position comes down to one question. Does the sea around you carry other people's business, or does it just carry weather? Get that answer right, and a scrap of land the mainland lords would consider worthless can out-earn a fertile inland manor 10 times its size. Get it wrong, and you have bought yourself a very expensive, very cold, very wet liability. We are going to build this the way you would have had to build it. How you get the island in the first place, what you actually own once you have it, how each resource turns into revenue, what it costs to hold on to any of it, and what kills the whole operation when your luck runs out. And we are not going to invent a single number. Medieval islands vary enormously by sea, by century, and by who was doing the counting, so every figure in this video is either drawn directly from a surviving record or clearly marked as an estimate. Let's start with how you get the thing. There is no medieval real estate agent for this. You get an island one of 4 ways, and each way comes with different strings attached. The first is the royal grant. The crown owns, in theory, everything it hasn't given away, and a small offshore island is exactly the kind of asset a king likes to hand to someone useful because it costs him nothing to give, and it lets him reward loyalty without touching valuable mainland territory. Lundy Island, sitting in the middle of the Bristol Channel between Devon and Wales, was granted this way more than once. Henry II first granted it to the Knights Templar sometime in the 1150s to 1160s, and King John's Charter of 1199/1200 confirmed that earlier grant. It didn't stick. By 1234, it belonged to the de Morisco family, who had their own ideas about what a private island in a major shipping channel was for, and we will get to that. The second route is conquest, dressed up afterward as a legal grant. This is how the Venetian nobleman Marco Sanudo became Duke of Naxos in the early 1200s. In the chaotic aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, when Constantinople had just been sacked and the Byzantine Empire had fragmented, Sanudo borrowed a handful of galleys from the Venetian state, sailed into the Aegean with a group of fellow adventurers, and took the island of Naxos after a siege of several weeks against a mix of Genoese occupiers and Greek resistance. He then did what every successful medieval land grabber did next. He divided his prize into dozens of smaller fiefs and handed them to his companions, turning a piece of piracy into a functioning feudal state almost overnight. Naxos became the capital of an island duchy that would, at its largest, control most of the Cyclades. The third route is the monastic foundation. A bishop or an abbot claims a vision, a saint, or simply a strategic need, and a religious house acquires an island the way Winchester College acquired the land under an inn, not by buying it outright, but by being granted it, then developing it slowly with the church's much longer investment horizon. Mont Saint-Michel, the tidal island off Normandy, became the property of a Benedictine abbey this way from the 10th century onward, and the monks who ran it were playing a different game than a lay lord. They weren't looking for a payback in 5 years. They were building for centuries. The fourth route, and the one that becomes more common as the medieval period goes on, is the lease. You don't own the island outright. You rent the rights to it, usually from the crown, for an annual sum, and you keep whatever profit you can extract above that. This is a much faster, much riskier way in because you have none of the landlord's patience and all of the operator's exposure. Whichever door you walk through, one fact stays constant. An island is never really yours the way a purchased house is yours today. It is yours conditionally, for as long as you can defend it, pay for it, or make yourself useful enough that nobody bothers to take it back. So the grant is signed. What do you actually control? Land, obviously, for whatever farming or grazing it can support. But an island lord's real estate is stranger than a mainland lord's because a huge share of the value sits below the high tide line, the foreshore, the seabed close to shore, the right to anything that washes up, the right to fish in the surrounding water, the right to charge for anchorage in any natural harbor. All of this typically comes bundled with the grant, and on most mainland estates, it would be worthless. On an island, it is often the whole business. You also, depending on your charter, control the right to hold a market, collect tolls on goods moving through your harbor, and in some cases claim a cut of any wreck that comes ashore. That last one sounds grim, and it was. Wreck of the sea, the right to keep goods from a shipwreck, was a real and valuable medieval property right, and more than one island lord's fortune had a wrecked cargo of wine or wool somewhere in its foundations. What you do not automatically control is the water beyond your immediate coast. The open sea lanes stay open, in principle, to everyone. Your leverage isn't ownership of the water, it's ownership of the only safe place to stop. This is the single most important economic fact about owning a medieval island, so it's worth saying plainly. A good natural harbor is worth more than every acre of farmland you will ever own. Think about what a ship's captain is actually buying when he pulls into your bay. Shelter from a storm that could sink his cargo and his crew. Fresh water, without which nobody sails anywhere. Food, for a crew that has been eating dried and salted rations for days or weeks. Repairs, if his rigging or hull needs attention before the next leg of the voyage. A place to trade a portion of his cargo for local goods. So the voyage pays for itself in stages rather than all at once at the final destination. Every one of those needs is a line item you can charge for, and none of them require you to grow, catch, mine, or build anything yourself. You are selling the coastline. It just happens to already exist. This is why the Duchy of Naxos was worth fighting over, even though the island itself was modest farmland by Mediterranean standards. The Cyclades sat directly across the sea lanes linking Venice to its trading colonies further east, toward Constantinople and Crete and the ports of Anatolia. Whoever held those islands could offer Venetian shipping safe anchorage, fresh water, and a friendly flag flying over the harbor, in exchange for a share of the trade passing through. Sanudo wasn't just acquiring farmland with a nice sea view, he was buying a toll booth on one of the busiest shipping corridors in the medieval Mediterranean. The flip side of that same coastline logic explains Lundy. Lundy sits almost in the middle of the Bristol Channel, directly in the path of every ship sailing to or from the port of Bristol, which by the high medieval period was one of England's most important trading towns. An island lord with a legitimate charter could, in theory, run this exactly like Naxos, offer shelter, charge for anchorage, sell water, and provisions. The de Morisco family, who held Lundy through much of the 13th century, ran a different version of the same business model. Instead of charging a toll and letting the ship continue, they simply took the cargo. Lundy became a pirate base preying on Bristol Channel shipping, protected by the fact that no navy of the period could easily dislodge a fortified position surrounded by open water and difficult currents. It took a direct royal assault to end it. In 1242, after William de Morisco was implicated in a plot against Henry III, the king had him captured, executed for treason, and built a royal castle on the island specifically to prevent the next family from trying the same trick. That is the harbor business laid bare. A safe anchorage on a busy shipping lane can be monetized honestly through tolls and provisioning, or dishonestly through extortion and outright theft, and for a remote island lord with a strong enough position, the second option was frequently the more tempting one. It just came with a correspondingly higher chance that the crown would eventually show up with soldiers instead of customers. A harbor gets you ships stopping, a market gets you those ships' crews and cargo spending money while they're there, and a formal toll system turns casual visits into a predictable revenue stream. Nowhere shows this better, and nowhere shows how badly it can go wrong than the Baltic island of Gotland. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Visby, the main town on Gotland, had become one of the central hubs of Baltic trade, sitting almost exactly between the German ports to the south and the Russian trading post at Novgorod to the east. Merchants passing between those two worlds stopped at Visby to trade, resupply, and wait out the sailing season, and the town grew rich enough to raise a limestone wall over 3.5 kilometers long, studded with roughly 50 towers, one of the most complete fortified merchant towns to survive from medieval northern Europe. But here's the part that matters economically. Gotland wasn't just Visby. It was also a rural island of independent farmers, the Goods, who had been trading on their own account with the mainland for generations before Visby ever grew into a Hanseatic power. As German merchants came to dominate the Hanseatic League and pushed to restrict membership to towns rather than individuals, they had every incentive to force all trade through Visby's gates, where it could be taxed, controlled, and counted. Around 1287 to 88, merchants in Visby sought to do exactly that, pushing to compel the island's rural farmers to route their exports through the town rather than trading directly with foreign ships themselves, though historians are not certain about the exact trigger of the conflict that followed. The farmers, who had been running their own trade for as long as anyone could remember, did not accept this quietly. The dispute over who had the right to control trade and collect tolls on Gotland escalated into open civil war in 1288 between the walled merchant town and the rural countryside around it, and it took the intervention of the Swedish crown to force a settlement. This is the toll business in its purest form. Whoever controls the point where goods must pass gets to charge for the privilege, and everyone who used to trade freely before that choke point existed has every reason to fight you over it. An island market or toll station is not a neutral service. It's a claim on wealth that other people used to keep for themselves, and they remember that. Beyond the harbor and the toll, an island lord's income depends on what the rock and the surrounding water actually produce. This varies enormously by region, and the honest answer is that most medieval islands were not agriculturally rich. Limited arable land, thin soil, and constant salt spray make islands poor grain country almost everywhere in Europe. What they are frequently rich in is something more specific, one resource the surrounding sea or the local geology happens to concentrate. For the Isle of Man, sitting in the middle of the Irish Sea, that resource was herring. Shoals of spawning herring passed close to the Manx coast on a predictable seasonal migration, drawing fishermen not just from the island itself, but from ports across the Irish Sea. And the Lords of Man built a formal system to take their cut. A Manx statute recorded under the year 1417 lays out the arrangement precisely. For every boat that took 5 mies of herring, 1 full mies was owed to the lord as a castle mies, used to feed the garrisons at Castle Rushen and Peel Castle, with the same 1/5 proportion applying down to smaller catches. This wasn't a vague seasonal tribute, it was a fixed proportional tax in kind on the catch itself, paid directly in fish rather than coin, collected specifically to feed the soldiers defending the lord's fortresses. The fishery didn't just generate income, it generated the actual food that made holding a garrison affordable in the first place. For the islands ringing the Bay of Bourgneuf on France's Atlantic coast, most famously Noirmoutier, the resource was salt. Salt marshes had been developed on Noirmoutier since at least the early medieval period, worked by generations of laborers who dug and maintained the shallow evaporation pans, called oeillettes, that let sun and wind do the work of concentrating seawater into crystallized salt. By the 13th century, this bay salt had become part of genuinely international trade, first with the British Isles, and from the later 14th century onward with the northern European cities of the Hanseatic League, whose ships sailed specifically to the small Port du Calais to load cargoes of salt bound for the fisheries and kitchens of the Baltic and North Sea coasts. Salt was not a luxury good. It was the only reliable way to preserve meat and fish through a medieval winter, which meant demand for it was essentially guaranteed every single year, storms and wars permitting. An island that controlled a productive salt marsh controlled a slice of a market that never really went away. For Naxos and several of its neighboring islands in the Cyclades, the resource was mineral rather than agricultural. High-quality marble, along with corundum, sometimes called emery, a hard abrasive mineral used for polishing and grinding, both of which were valuable exports back to Venice. This is a useful reminder that island resources doesn't only mean fish and salt. Whatever the local geology happened to concentrate, an island lord with the labor to extract it and the ships to move it had a genuine export business, however small the island itself. Livestock and limited arable farming supplemented all of these economies, and islands with enough grazing land could run sheep or cattle profitably, since the surrounding water functioned as a free fence against theft and against the animals wandering off. But the honest pattern across nearly every documented medieval island economy is that the sea itself, not the soil, was doing the heavy lifting. Fish, salt, minerals, tolls, and trade consistently outperformed grain and livestock as sources of real income, because the sea was the one resource genuinely unique to island geography. None of this income arrives for free. Holding an island means paying for the same categories of overhead any medieval lord faced, with the added and expensive complication that everything is harder to get to. A castle, or fortified position, if your island has one, needs a permanent garrison, and that garrison needs to be fed year-round, which is precisely the problem the Isle of Man's castle mies system was built to solve. Walls, where they existed, represented an enormous prior capital investment, and Visby's 3.5-kilometer limestone circuit with 50 towers is the clearest surviving example of just how much a wealthy trading island was willing to spend to protect what it had built. Boats, for fishing, ferrying, and patrol, needed constant maintenance against salt water, which corrodes and rots far faster than fresh water ever will. Wells or cisterns for fresh water were not a luxury luxury on a small island. They were often the single point of failure that determined whether you could support a garrison and a fishing fleet at all or neither. Storage, particularly for salt and grain, had to be kept dry against sea air that ruined stored goods faster than almost any inland climate. And roads, where an island had enough interior settlement to need them, still had to be built and maintained with the same labor and materials as anywhere else, just delivered by boat first. Layered on top of all of that is the wage bill. Fishermen and salt workers whose skill directly determined your annual yield, sailors and boat crews to move goods to market, craftsmen for repairs that couldn't wait for the next supply ship, officials to collect tolls, weigh catches, and enforce the Lord's rights. Because a toll nobody is checking is a toll nobody is paying. And if your island had any strategic value at all, soldiers whose presence was the only real deterrent against exactly the kind of seizure Lundy suffered in 1242. The uncomfortable truth about this list is that almost every item on it scales with your success, not against it. A profitable fishery needs more boats and more workers to police. A busy harbor needs more officials to collect tolls honestly and more soldiers to make sure honestly is enforced. A wealthy trading town needs a bigger wall, which is exactly the chain of cause and effect that turned Visba into a fortress, and then, around 1287 to 88, into a flashpoint for civil war with its own countryside. Growth on an island doesn't reduce your overhead. It usually just moves you into a more expensive bracket of overhead. Now for the part that separates a genuinely profitable island from an expensive piece of rock. What happens when things go wrong? Because on an island, they go wrong differently than they do on the mainland. Storms are not a mainland lord's problem in the same way. A bad storm on land damages a roof or a field. A bad storm at sea can sink the fishing fleet that was your entire annual income, drown the salt workers caught out on an exposed marsh, or simply prevent any ship from reaching you for weeks, cutting off both your exports and your supplies at the same time. An island's entire economic engine can stop not because demand collapsed, but because the weather made the harbor unusable. Famine hits islands from an unusual angle. Because arable land is so often limited, many island communities depended on the mainland for a meaningful share of their grain even in good years, trading fish, salt, or minerals for the bread grain their own soil couldn't fully provide. That arrangement works beautifully right up until the moment mainland trade is disrupted, at which point an island's isolation, its greatest defensive asset, becomes the exact mechanism of its starvation. The same sea that kept invaders out could just as easily keep grain ships from getting in. Moral piracy is the risk that islands generate as much as they suffer from, and Lundy is the clearest illustration of both directions at once. The same remoteness and defensibility that let the de Moriscos run a pirate operation out of the island in the 13th century made Lundy an attractive pirate base again centuries later, when English authorities in Barnstaple repeatedly tried and failed to fully suppress raiders using the island as a refuge. An island lord who couldn't or wouldn't police the waters around his own coast risked becoming a magnet for exactly the kind of outlaw activity that would eventually draw the attention and the fleet of a much larger power. War and blockade could be the fastest and most total form of ruin, and Gotland's history supplies the sharpest example. In 1361, King Valdemar IV of Denmark invaded the island. The fortified town of Visby, protected by its expensive wall, closed its gates and, according to the traditional account, chose not to fight, while roughly 1,800 rural Gotlanders without comparable defenses were killed fighting the Danish army outside the walls before Visby's own gates were opened to let the conquerors in. Whatever the precise casualty figures, which come down to us through tradition rather than a contemporary headcount, the structural lesson is stark. The wealth concentrated behind a wall can survive a conquest that the undefended countryside around it cannot, and an island's fortifications protect capital, not necessarily people. The Duchy of Naxos shows the slower version of the same collapse. Its prosperity through the 13th and 14th centuries depended on relatively secure trade routes and a favorable balance of power between Venice and its Mediterranean rivals. From the second half of the 14th century onward, escalating war and piracy in the Aegean steadily eroded that security, and by the time the Ottoman admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa conquered the Cyclades in the late 1530s, the duchy that remained was allowed to survive only as a heavily taxed dependency, its rulers squeezed by an occupying power support until the arrangement finally collapsed entirely under the weight of its own tax burden. An island's wealth built on controlling a trade route is only as durable as your ability to keep that route safe, and eventually, on a long enough timeline, someone stronger always shows up to test that. Plague, finally, hit islands with a particular cruelty, because the same isolation that made a good harbor valuable also meant a small, contained population had nowhere to disperse to, and no easy way to replace lost labor quickly. A fishing crew, a garrison, or a team of salt workers reduced by disease couldn't simply be topped up from a large regional labor pool the way a mainland manor might manage. On a small island, the workforce essentially was the economy, and there was no slack in the system to absorb a bad year. There is one more risk worth naming, and it's the strange kind that only shows up once you've actually succeeded, becoming valuable enough that someone more powerful than you decides your island shouldn't be privately held at all. Both Gotland and the Isle of Man eventually illustrate this on different timelines. Gotland's wealth and strategic position in the Baltic made it a target not just for opportunistic raiders, but for the kings of Denmark and Sweden directly, precisely because a rich, semi-independent trading island sitting on a major sea route was too valuable a strategic asset to leave entirely alone. The Isle of Man's long run under a succession of private lords, who profited enormously from its position in the Irish Sea and its customs revenue, eventually collided with the interests of a much larger neighbor. By the 18th century, the island's usefulness as a base for smuggling goods past English customs had become such a drain on royal revenue that the British Crown bought out the lordship entirely in 1765, ending centuries of private control specifically because the island's economic value had become too significant for a private family to keep monopolizing. That sits after our medieval period proper, but it's the logical endpoint of the same dynamic that runs through the whole story. An island that becomes rich enough, or strategically placed enough, eventually attracts the attention of whoever is powerful enough to simply take the position away from you. Political importance, for an island lord, was never entirely a reward. It was also a countdown. So, was owning a medieval island a fortune waiting to be collected, or an expensive piece of land surrounded by water? Both, and the difference between the two comes down almost entirely to one thing. Did your island sit on something the sea itself made scarce? A herring migration route, a productive salt marsh, a deposit of marble, or a natural harbor on a genuine shipping lane could turn a patch of unfarmable rock into an income stream that outperformed inland manors many times its size, because you weren't competing with every other landowner selling grain. You were selling something almost nobody else nearby could offer. Isle of Man fishermen paid their lord in fish because there was no substitute source of fish nearby. Hanseatic ships sailed specifically to the Bay of Bourgneuf because that particular salt could not be replicated at will elsewhere. Venetian shipping needed Naxos's harbors because the alternative was open water with no shelter at all. That kind of geographic monopoly is genuinely rare on land, and it's the closest thing the medieval economy had to owning a toll booth on a road everyone had to use. But every one of those same advantages came bundled with a mirror image vulnerability. The isolation that kept out competitors also kept out reinforcements, replacement grain, and rescue. The concentrated wealth that made an island worth defending also made it worth conquering, worth taxing into submission, or eventually worth simply buying back out from under you. And the overhead of holding any of it, garrisons, walls, boats, wells, officials, scaled up right alongside your success, so that a good decade could just as easily be followed by a single storm, a single blockade, or a single war that erased most of what you'd built. The honest answer, then, is that a medieval island was rarely a fortune and rarely a total loss. It was a bet on geography, and the size of the payout depended entirely on how narrow and how valuable your particular choke point of sea actually was. Get a rich fishery, a productive salt marsh, or a genuine shipping lane, and defend it competently, and you could build real and lasting wealth from a piece of land the main landlords wouldn't have looked at twice. Get an island with none of that, or lose the ability to defend what you had, and you were left holding exactly what it looked like from the deck of a passing ship. A cold, wet, expensive piece of rock, surrounded on every side by water that owed you nothing.